Hi, I'm Jamie. I want to talk a little bit about designing disaster recovery for digital collections today, which is a practicum that I'm doing in the University Library Preservation Unit. We think of digital content a lot of the time as ephemera, as something that always kind of exists in the air around us, that's sort of always everywhere, but not actually tied to the real world that we live in. How many of you have taken digital preservation that are here right now? So a bunch of you, yeah. So you'll have heard whoever your digital preservation instructor is talk about that a lot. And when we talk about digital disasters, we think a lot of the time about digitally generated disasters. So it kind of evokes, like, to me, a team of elite hackers in a movie or something that are taking down traffic lights or hospital generators. But digital content is actually highly susceptible to damage from your really pedestrian everyday disasters too. And here I'm focusing on fire disasters, which include fire, followed by dust or ash, and usually water as well. Often in the form of a fire suppression system or your local firefighters. Slide, yeah. To even begin thinking about disaster recovery for library digital collections, you need to think about their material presence in the world. So where do collections live, and on what, and who cares for their physical bodies? The first step of my practicum was attempting to figure this out, which is harder than it sounds at the get-go. First of all, there's no inventory of library digital collections, or even of the services that we use. So what happens if the metadata for a collection lives on one server and the assets live somewhere else, and only the metadata server is damaged in a fire event? So we really need to know where everything is something that I'm learning, which we don't right now, and I'm working on it. There's a lot that needs to be considered in a disaster recovery plan beyond replacing or repairing damaged content. I mean, of course, the goal is to salvage as much as possible and to prevent further damage, just like with an analog collection. But our digital assets do exist in the world, but they're extremely distributed, and there are a lot of instantiations of them. So we have our archival copies, and we have our access copies, and we have our backups, and we have the backups of our backups, hopefully. So we need to make sure that we are identifying, following a disaster situation like a fire event, that our assets are actually involved or at risk. We don't know. With an analog collection, that's a lot easier. You can say, like, okay, there's arson in the Maps library, our 20th century collections are compromised, hopefully that will never happen. But when you're talking about digital assets, it could be something like, okay, there's been a fire in the digital computer lab, the DCL, which, by the way, basically everything that's considered a library production service is on servers there. Lots of other stuff is on servers there too, so we just need to kind of assume that all of our stuff is damaged until we get to the assessment phase and can find out for sure. So you try to figure out if you have assets in the disaster area. You notify the people who will fulfill specific roles on the disaster recovery team. You assess the damage to your resources, you salvage what you can, purchase what you can't, and you rebuild, and that's how it should essentially work. But there are a lot of challenges associated with digital collections. I'm just going to touch on one because I think it's the most important, and it's coordination. One of the major challenges for disaster recovery for digital collections is that they're distributed. So it's our stuff, but it's renting a house. So let's return to our scenario where there's a fire event in the DCL. That's a little bit dramatic, but it's also a possibility. That building's an engineering building, kind of. It's really kind of a sites building, and it's kind of a central IT building. At this point, we don't really know whose building it is, right? There's a lot of people who have assets there. They have other priorities that can't even be considered in a library disaster scenario, and they have access to the servers. They have the keys, they have the management, they have the administration. So they might be making decisions that could impact library content, and because they sort of have jurisdiction, a lot of coordination is required in a disaster recovery management plan, and that's definitely been the biggest challenge of trying to create this plan, is getting everybody on board. The takeaway here is that depending on the disaster location and the kinds of resources affected, you're going to have a lot of variation in recovery. I've been in touch with the GSLIS students, and you might know her, Heidi Uphoff, who recently produced a really impressive digital recovery plan for the Illinois Institute of Technology. And she's had this idea of a suite of sort of modular boutique recovery plans that I've decided to try to implement to some degree in the final iteration of my practicum.